There is a particular kind of man who loves in silence, not because he is shy, not because he lacks the words, but because somewhere along the way, he decided that watching from a distance was safer than reaching out and wanting something he might lose. That distance, for him, was not emptiness. It was a kind of devotion, the only one he knew how to sustain, a quiet and invisible faithfulness that left no mark on the person it was meant for. Kang Tae-Yang was that kind of man, and for 3 full years, without a single word spoken, he watched Amara Osei-Bonsu build a life that he was never brave enough to ask to be part of. He watched from the rooftop of the glass building directly across the street, from her office, from the corner table of the cafe, on the ground floor of her block, from the far edge of every room she walked into. He told himself it was protection that the world he moved in was full of men with long memories and short tempers, men who hurt people they barely knew, in order to reach the people they wanted to punish. He told himself that keeping her in his line of sight was a practical decision, a security measure, a professional calculation made by a man whose entire life had been built on professional calculations. He told himself that every single day, for 3 years, with the discipline of someone who has learned to believe his own most necessary lies, and every single day, the lie tasted a little worse than the one before it. Seoul does not sleep, and it does not slow down for men who are standing still. It hums and glitters, and moves at a velocity that swallows the uncertain, the hesitant, the ones who are waiting for a better moment that never arrives. Amara had come to Seoul 10 years earlier from Accra, Ghana, bright-eyed and entirely unafraid, carrying a degree in architectural design, and a laugh that sounded like it had never, once in her life, been held back or rationed. She had built herself into something formidable in this city, rising to become a principal architect at one of the most respected design firms in Seoul, known for work that other architects studied, and clients waited years to commission. Her designs were recognized for the way they married traditional West African spatial philosophy, the communal logic of compound living, the relationship between structure and sky, with the clean, deliberate precision of Korean modernism. Her work had been featured in international architecture publications. Her name had appeared on shortlists for awards that most designers spent entire careers chasing, and her reputation was quietly becoming the kind that preceded her into every room. She had done all of this without Tae-Yang. Every project, every late night, every breakthrough, every moment of doubt that she had moved through alone, and come out the other side of stronger than before. That was the part he sat with on the nights when his penthouse felt like a museum of his own worst decisions, the understanding that she had needed nothing from him, that her story had not missed him at all. She had done all of it entirely on her own, and he had watched every single step of it from the periphery, too afraid to stand beside her and too unable, in the end, to walk away. The story of how Kang Tae-Yang came to love Amara Osei-Bonsu is not a gentle one. It does not begin with a glance across a crowded room, a hand extended at a party, a moment arranged by the comfortable machinery of fate. It begins with a mistake, his mistake, on a Tuesday night in Itaewon, when his men were tracking a rival operative through the district, and the operative ducked into a restaurant that Tae-Yang's people then locked down without checking who was inside. What they had not anticipated was that the restaurant was hosting a private gallery, opening that evening a showcase of young designers whose work explored the intersection of African and Asian visual traditions. Attended by 40 people who had nothing to do with anything, his men cleared the exits as a tactical precaution, and in doing so, trapped every one of those 40 civilians inside art students, young professionals, couples on dates, none of them understanding what was happening or why they could not leave. And then one woman in a burnt orange dress walked directly up to Tae-Yang, not to his bodyguards, not to the nearest exit, not to the wall, where she might have pressed herself and waited for it to be over. Directly to him. "You need to let these people go," she said, in Korean that was clean and precise, and accented in a way that told him she had not learned it casually, that she had sat with the language until it gave itself to her properly. Her eyes told him something else entirely, that she was terrified, that her hands were probably shaking inside the sleeves of that burnt orange dress, and that she had made a decision somewhere between standing up and crossing the room not to let the terror choose for her. He had stared at her for 4 full seconds, which in his world was a very long time to stand still in front of a stranger, long enough for every one of his men to notice and say nothing about it. He cleared the restaurant in under 3 minutes, and he spent the 6 months that followed, pretending with remarkable discipline that he did not know exactly who she was, that he had not asked Byun to find out her name before the night was over. The problem with watching a woman like Amara is that she does not stay still long enough for watching to ever feel like it is enough. She moved through the world with an appetite for it that made the edges of every room she entered feel slightly more alive. On Saturdays, she walked the full length of the Han River, stopping wherever something caught her eye. A particular bridge, old men bent over a paddock, bored, children scattering bread for pigeons, the way the evening light broke itself apart against the towers of Yeouido. At exactly 6 o'clock, she was compiling something he came to realize a private archive of the city. She had chosen a visual record, built with the patience of someone who had decided to understand Seoul from the inside rather than simply live inside it. He had her security detail report her routes each morning, told his head of intelligence. It was standard monitoring of a civilian with potential ties to foreign nationals, a sentence so bureaucratically composed that it almost convinced him it was true. His head of intelligence, a man named Byun, who had worked for him for 9 years and lied fluently on his behalf across 4 continents, had received this explanation with a face of such perfect and diplomatic blankness that Tae-Yang knew immediately he had been completely seen through. Byun said nothing, and that silence was the loudest thing in the room, because Byun's silence was a form of communication, a careful and loyal man's way of acknowledging something, without forcing the other person to acknowledge it first. It was in the 2nd year that Tae-Yang made the mistake that made everything worse, which was to go to one of her gallery openings not close, not anywhere she would see him, just at the back of the room in a dark jacket, watching. He watched the way she spoke about each piece of work, with a warmth that was not performed, not the warmth of someone who had learned to seem interested, but the genuine warmth of a person who found things beautiful and was not embarrassed to say so. He watched the way she listened to people, fully in the way that made each person feel like they were the most interesting one in the room, leaning slightly forward, her eyes doing the thing eyes do when they are actually paying attention and not just waiting for their turn to speak. He watched the way she threw her head back when something was genuinely funny, as though joy were not a thing to be measured or rationed or kept in proportion, but something you simply surrendered to when it arrived, completely and without apology. A man approached her near the far wall, tall, well-dressed, Korean, carrying the particular kind of easy confidence that comes not from achievement, but from having been raised in a world that expected you to be comfortable in it. He handed her a glass of wine and said something that made her smile, not the professional smile she used when she was working a room, the measured and gracious one, but the real one, the one that reached her eyes before it reached her mouth. Tae-Yang left the gallery and went back to his penthouse and sat in the dark for a very long time. And then he did the thing he would spend the following year being quietly ashamed of. He ran a full background check on the man. Park Soo-ho, diplomat's son, clean record, no known criminal affiliations, a man who liked jazz and had once been quoted in a design publication, calling African architecture the most undervalued tradition in the global architectural canon, harmless by every professional measure that Tae-Yang had spent 15 years using to assess the people who entered his world, and dangerous by the one measure that had nothing to do with any of that. He closed the file, told himself it was none of his business, opened the file again at 2 in the morning, and sat with it until the city outside his window began to go grey, with the approaching dawn, hating himself with a precision he usually reserved for enemies. The thing that finally broke the 3 years of silence was not a dramatic moment. It was a Thursday afternoon in November, grey and cold, Amara crossing the street outside her office, with a roll of architectural plans under one arm, and her phone in her other hand. She was not watching the road, she was reading something on her screen, moving with the distracted confidence of someone who has crossed this particular street 1,000 times without incident, which is exactly the kind of confidence that precedes incidents. The delivery truck that came around the corner was moving faster than the posted limit, and Tae-Yang's car was 6 vehicles back in traffic, and his driver had not yet seen it, and there were perhaps 2 seconds between the truck and the crosswalk. Tae-Yang was out of the car before Byun could react, moving with a speed and flatness of intent that his body remembered. even when the rest of him had tried to forget it, covering the distance to the crosswalk in a sprint he had not needed to use in years. He pulled her back by the arm, and the truck passed close enough that the displaced air of it flattened her hair against her face, and the roll of architectural plans tumbled from her grip and scattered across the wet pavement in every direction. Amara stood absolutely still for a moment, the way people do when the body has just processed something the mind hasn't caught up to yet. Then she turned slowly and she saw who was holding her arm. The recognition moved across her face in layers of surprise. First, clean and unguarded, and then beneath it, the older memory of a restaurant in Itaewon, and a man who had cleared 40 people out of a locked room without raising his voice. And then something else, something that had been sitting underneath all of it for a long time, waiting for a reason to surface something she looked at briefly, and then set aside in the practiced way of a woman who does not let things move her before she is ready. He crouched down without speaking and began collecting her plans from the pavement, picking them up carefully one by one while she stood and watched him do it, and she did not help, because she was very busy trying to understand what she was feeling. He stood and held the roll out to her. She took it without letting her fingers touch his hand, said thank you in a voice that was perfectly steady, in a way that cost her something, and he nodded and he turned to leave. I've seen you before, she said to his back, and he stopped and stayed still. And she said more than once, and the words landed, with the particular weight of something that had been held for a long time before being set down. He turned around slowly, and her eyes were doing something he did not know how to absorb. She was not accusing him. She was not frightened. She was asking, and the asking was far more difficult to stand in front of than any accusation would have been. At my gallery opening, she said, quietly 18 months ago, in the dark jacket at the back of the room, and outside my office in March, and at the Han River on a Saturday in June, where you stayed for 2 hours and left before I finished. The silence between them held about 14 different kinds of weight, and he said nothing, because there was nothing available to him in that moment. That was both true and also safe, and he had not yet decided which one he was willing to sacrifice. I'm not afraid of you, she said. I want you to know that. I know what kind of man you are. I've known it since the restaurant, and I am still not afraid of you, which is either very wise or very foolish, and I haven't decided which. She looked at him for a long, measured moment, the kind of look she probably gave to buildings she was assessing, looking for the logic underneath the surface, and then she walked away. And he stood in the wet street with the imprint of her arm still in his palm. He did not seek her out after that, but 3 days later, she walked into the cafe on the ground floor of her office building, the one where he sometimes sat at the corner table, and she got her coffee and looked around the room once, and walked directly to where he was sitting. She sat down across from him, as if she had been invited, as if this was an established arrangement between two people, with a history of established arrangements, and she set her cup down and looked at him and said, I have questions, and I have ground rules. You answer honestly, or you don't answer at all. There is no middle version of the truth available in this conversation. No careful half-answer dressed up to resemble the whole thing. No version of events edited for my comfort or yours, do you understand? Yes, he said, and his voice came out lower than he intended, rougher, like something that had been kept in a closed room for a long time, and was unused to being asked to speak plainly. Why have you been watching me? She asked, and he considered the question for 3 full seconds, which is a long time to consider a question, when someone is sitting across from you waiting. And then he said, because I couldn't stop. She received that without expression, absorbed it the way she seemed to absorb most things, fully, without flinching, without performing a reaction. And then she asked, are you watching me because you think I'm a threat, or because of someone I'm connected to? No, he said, to both, and she looked at him and said, then why? And the simplicity of it, the directness, landed with more weight than a more complicated question would have, because simple questions require honest answers. And he had been dishonest for a very long time. Because the first time I saw you, he said carefully, you walked toward something that frightened you, and you did it anyway. And I had spent 15 years in a world where people either ran from fear or used it as a weapon, and I had never seen anyone simply walk through it the way you did. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, that is not a sufficient reason to follow someone for 3 years. And he said, no, it isn't. And he didn't try to make it sound like more than it was, because she had asked for honesty, and honesty sometimes sounds like not enough. "You should know," she said, "that I've known you were there. For most of it, not always, but often enough." And he stared at her, and she said, "I'm an architect. I notice space. I notice when the quality of a space changes, because something has entered it that wasn't there before. You are not a small presence, Kang Tae-Yang." She said his name the way you say something you've been carrying for a while, like setting it on a table between two people so they can both look at it. And he did not ask how she knew it, because he suspected the answer would be humbling. "Why didn't you say something?" he asked, and she looked at her coffee and said, "Because I was trying to understand what I felt about it. Because there is a version of what you were doing that should be frightening, and I needed to know which version I was actually living inside. But there was another version," she said, "one I kept coming back to, one that was harder to dismiss. And that version was this: you never came closer. You never made yourself known. You just stayed, like someone keeping watch without intending to close in. I haven't decided yet whether that's something I should thank you for or something I should be angry about," she said, and he said both are fair, and she almost smiled, and it was the closest thing to a smile he had ever been positioned near enough to see properly. She stood up, gathered her bag, said she had a site visit at 2, and then paused and said same time Thursday, and he understood that she was not asking whether he would be in the cafe. She was asking whether he would be there honestly, as himself at the table, not the periphery. "Yes," he said, and she walked out, and he sat for a very long time, looking at the empty chair across from him, feeling something he did not have an accurate word for, something that felt like the very dangerous beginning of being known by another person. Thursday came, and then the Thursday after that, and the one after that. They did not give the corner table a name, did not apply language to the thing that was slowly building itself in that cafe, and simply talked, which was something he had not done without strategy in a very long time. She told him about Accra, about her mother, who was a civil engineer, and her father, who was a secondary school teacher, and the way those two people had raised her to believe that the built world was not neutral, that the spaces people lived inside made direct decisions about who those people were allowed to become. She told him about the loneliness of the early years in Seoul, the particular kind that comes from being doubly foreign, Black and West African, in a city that had developed nuanced categories for many kinds of difference, but sometimes did not have a ready place for hers. She told him how she had decided to answer that loneliness, not by retreating from it, but by going further in, learning the language until she dreamed in it, mapping every district on foot, making Seoul account for her, until the city had no choice but to receive her on her own terms. He listened in the way he did everything completely, without division, giving her his full attention the way a man gives something. When he has decided, it is the most important thing in the room, and everything else is a distraction from it. She told him once, on a rainy Thursday, when the cafe was quieter than usual, that he listened the way architects read buildings, not for the surface, but for the structure underneath it, for the intention that existed before the thing was built. He told her that he had been watching her, because she was the most alive person he had encountered in 15 years of moving through a world that had trained him to see people as variables, as risks and assets and pressure points and margins, and she had refused from the first night to be any of those things. She was quiet for a long time after that, and then she said, "That might be the most honest thing a man has ever said to me," and he said, "It might be the most honest thing I have ever said to anyone," and the truth of that settled between them like something solid. And for the first time since the Thursdays began, something shifted between them, not dramatically, not with the ceremony of declared feelings, but with the quiet and definitive shift of two people who have simultaneously decided to stop, pretending that what they are doing is merely an exchange of information. The world Tae-Yang moved in did not tolerate softness. It was a world of leverage and consequence and carefully maintained fear, and he had built himself into a man that world respected and avoided, and occasionally tried to destroy when it miscalculated how prepared he was. He had constructed himself this way, deliberately, making himself into something that did not need to be loved, that needed only to be reckoned with, because needing to be loved was a weakness, and weaknesses in his world were not private, they were invitations. The problem was that Amara Osei-Bonsu made him want to be loved, not admired, not feared, not respected across a careful distance, loved by her specifically with the same unguarded fullness she brought to every other thing she decided to give herself to, and the wanting of it terrified him, in a way that no physical threat, in 15 years of them, had managed to, which told him something precise and unwelcome about the difference between dangers you can train for and dangers that find the part of you that training never reached. He told Byun because Byun had been with him long enough to receive certain kinds of information without reacting to them outwardly, and because Tae-Yang, for the first time in memory, needed to say it to another person to understand what it meant. "I think I'm going to make a mistake," he said. And Byun considered this and asked what kind of mistake. And Tae-Yang said the kind I can't take back, and Byun asked, "Are you asking me to stop you?" And Tae-Yang said, "No, I don't think I am." He told her on a Thursday that was not raining, in a cafe that was warm and amber-lit, while the street outside, filled with the particular golden light that Seoul produces briefly in late autumn, reluctantly before winter arrives and refuses to return it. She had been describing a community center in Mapo-gu, a client who had told her he wanted a building that felt like belonging, and she had spread a rough sketch across the table, between them, preliminary and unfinished, but already carrying the specific quality that made her work recognizable. The way space reached toward light in her drawings, the generosity of proportion, the sense that the people who would one day move through these walls had been thought of carefully. Before the first line was drawn, he had been looking at the sketch, and then he looked up, and she was already watching him. "I want to stop watching from a distance," he said, and the words came out without the careful architecture he usually put around anything he meant. "I want to be someone who is allowed to be near you, not as protection, not as surveillance, as something that doesn't have a professional name. I have spent 3 years learning everything about you that can be learned from the outside," he said, "and the parts I don't know are the parts you would have to choose to show me, and those are the parts I want if you are willing." Her hands were still on the sketch, and she did not look away from him, and she said, "What does that mean from a man like you?" And he understood that she was not asking about his feelings. She was asking about his world, about what proximity to it would cost a person. "It means I want to become the kind of man who deserves to sit at this table, without a lie attached to it." He said, "I am not that man yet. I know exactly what I am. But I would like to try to become him, with you watching, if you're willing to watch." She considered him the way she had considered him on the wet street after the truck, with a directness that did not look for comfortable answers, and did not flinch from the ones that weren't, and then she said, "That's a long project." He said, "I have time," and she said, "I'm not a renovation." Tae-Yang, and he said, "I know, you're the architect, I'm the building that needs work." And she looked at him for a long silent beat, and then she laughed. The real laugh, the one he had watched from across rooms and streets and riverbanks for 3 years, the one she gave completely, without managing or measuring it, and up close. It was even more devastating than it had been from any distance. He had observed it from before. She picked up her pen and made a small mark on the corner of the sketch, then turned it toward him. She had added a figure to the drawing, a single small shape, standing just outside the entrance of the building. Not inside, not gone, just there at the threshold, as if waiting to be let in. "You have a lot to learn about belonging somewhere," she said, and he said, "I know," and she said, "I'm a very good teacher." And then she folded the sketch carefully and put it away. And she stayed at the table, not leaving, just staying, which was the most complete answer she knew how to give. What came next was not a transformation, and Tae-Yang did not become a different man in any sudden or cinematic sense. That is not the way of things that are real, and both of them were people who had developed a deep intolerance for things that were not real. He began, slowly and without announcement, to dismantle the architecture of the world. He had spent 15 years building, territory by territory, alliance by alliance, the careful and unglamorous work of extracting himself from something that had been constructed to be very difficult to leave. It was contested at every step by men who had built careers inside the structure he was taking apart, who understood that his exit was not a private decision, but a structural event with consequences for everyone arranged around him, and he moved through their resistance with the same cold patience. He had once used to build the thing in the first place. There were 2 attempts to intimidate him in the first 6 months. Both failed, and one attempt on Amara, which failed faster, handled with the kind of efficiency that reminded everyone involved that the man dismantling the empire was still the man who had built it. She knew not the details, not the specific machinery of it, but she knew the shape of the work he was doing, and she did not pretend otherwise, did not perform the innocence of a woman who had chosen not to look at the thing that was directly in front of her. She was not naive, and she had never performed naivety. She held what she knew, and she kept watching him the way she had said she would, honestly and carefully and without flinching, which was the only kind of watching that had ever felt like anything real to him. "You're doing it," she told him one evening, walking along the Han River, the same stretch, where he had stood in a grey jacket on a June Saturday and watched her sketch for 2 hours and left before she finished. And he said, "It doesn't feel like enough." "It never does when you're inside it," she said, and she stopped walking and turned to face him and looked up at him in the particular way she did when she was about to say something that would take up residence in him and refuse to leave. 3 years ago, she said, when you walked into that restaurant in Itaewon and cleared those people out, I was terrified, and I walked toward you anyway, not because I was brave, but because I had decided that my fear did not get to be the one making my decisions. You are doing the same thing right now, she said every day, walking toward something that frightens you, and I recognized it in you that first night, because I know exactly what it looks like from the outside, and it looks like the most quietly difficult thing a person can do. He had no language for what moved through him, standing on that riverbank, so he simply stood very still in the autumn, dark, and let himself be seen by her, fully, without the armor, without the calculation, without the distance he had kept between himself and everything that mattered for 15 years. She reached up and adjusted the collar of his coat, with the brisk practicality of someone who had decided she had the right to small gestures, and said better and resumed walking, and he fell into step beside her with no space between them. No periphery, nothing managed, just the river and the cold and the city going on around them, and the strange, irreversible fact of two people who had been choosing each other across 3 years of silence, finally, quietly, choosing each other out loud. A year later, the community center in Mapo-gu opened. It was everything Amara had promised her client and considerably more, a building that the architectural press called a triumph of intercultural philosophy, a structure that made the people inside it feel exactly as the client had asked, like they belonged somewhere. Her name was spoken with reverence in conversations. She was not present for by designers, who studied the drawings by clients, who put themselves on waiting lists for projects. She hadn't announced yet by people in the industry, who used her name when they meant a particular kind of uncompromising quality. At the opening reception, she moved through the crowd with the warmth she brought to everything, speaking to each person, as though they were the reason the evening existed, listening with the full attention that made people feel, for the duration of the conversation, like the most interesting person in any room. Tae-Yang stood to the side, not watching from across the room this time, but watching from across the room of a building she had made, which was different in a way he did not immediately have words for. Different in a way that meant something he was still learning the shape of. Byoon appeared beside him with 2 glasses of water, handed him one and said nothing for a moment, and then, with the careful understatement of a man who had always communicated, most precisely in what he chose not to say, "It's a good building." Tae-Yang said yes, and Byoon said, "She's a good architect." And Tae-Yang said yes, and Byoon looked at him sideways and said, "You look like a man who is exactly where he's supposed to be." And Tae-Yang considered this and found that it was true. It was a strange feeling to sit inside, not comfortable yet, still new enough to feel slightly improbable, the way a room feels when you have just moved into it, and everything is still in the place someone else arranged, rather than the place you would arrange it, but real, undeniably and permanently real. Across the room, Amara caught his eye and made a small gesture with her chin. Come over, not a command, not a request exactly, just an acknowledgement. A door held open by someone who had decided a long time ago that the door was going to stay open. He handed Byoon the water glass and walked across the room. No bodyguards flanking him, no distance maintained, no careful management of the space between himself and the thing he wanted most, just the length of a room. And then, at the end of it, her. She smiled when he reached her, the real one, full and unrationed, the one he had watched from rooftops and cafe corners and riverbanks for 3 years, and up close, 1 year into being allowed to stand close enough to receive it. It still, every single time, knocked the air from his lungs. He thought, this is what I was watching from a distance, and then he thought, this is what it costs to stop watching, and the answer was everything. All of it, every careful structure he had built to keep himself separate from anything that could reach him, and it was worth every single piece of it. Outside, Seoul moved on in all its noise. and velocity and magnificent indifference, and inside this building, made of light and intention and one woman's refusal to let space be anything less than generous. A man who had spent 3 years learning to love at a safe distance was learning finally something harder, how to love from right here, close enough to be changed by it, close enough that there was nowhere left to stand. That was not inside the thing itself, close enough at last to stay. He did not know, standing in that room she had built, that 11 days from now, she would walk into her office on a Wednesday morning and find something waiting on the floor, something that would tell him, without a single word spoken, that the world he had been dismantling had not yet finished deciding what it wanted to take from him. He did not know that someone had been watching the watcher, that, while he spent 3 years learning the shape of her life, from a careful distance, someone else had spent that same time learning the shape of his watching, and had waited with a patience that matched his own for the exact moment he had something worth threatening. He did not know any of that yet, and so he simply stood in the room. She had made and received her smile, and let himself believe, for 11 more days, that the hardest part was already behind him. It was not. If this story moved you, hit the like button and let us know in the comments. Which moment stayed with you? The longest, was it the ground rules at the corner table, or the small figure she drew at the entrance of the building, waiting to be let in? Subscribe, so you never miss what comes next, because part 2 begins 11 days later, with a white envelope, a locked door, and a question written on the back of a photograph that will change everything.